I've broken week 11 down into two separate screencasts. I'm going to talk about Frederick Douglass, just some background information about him first, and then I will do another screencast for the other author, Harriet Jacobs, for this week, because there's kind of a lot to unpack with Mr. Douglass. He was born into slavery sometime around 1818 in Maryland. For the majority of slaves at the time period, there was no registry of their birth, exact date and time. So it's kind of one of those things that after a certain time, like it was a roundabout kind of thing, and then slaves would choose their own names later on, and they would choose a date that they would want to celebrate their birthday. That was pretty kind of commonplace at the time. He initially lived with his grandmother, his mother's mother, Betty Bailey. His mother was kind of in and out of his life, kind of intermittently, until she died when he was 10, and when he was 10 years old. So at a young age, he was selected to live in the home of the plantation owners. It was kind of widely believed at the time, which was kind of common practice, that Douglas's father was one of the plantation owners that he ended up that he lived with for periods of time, and he was kind of moved about. He was moved about several times through different owners. When he was around 12, he went to live with the Alds. Hugh Ald and Sophia Ald was his wife, and he lived in the house, which was obviously the best place for slaves to live, was inside the home, and so he lived in the house, and Sophia taught him the alphabet, and which was kind of crazy at the time, because there was kind of an unspoken law mandate that you did not teach slaves to read and write. You did not want them educated. You wanted them ignorant of all the ways, and then that way the white men could have more power over them. So when her husband when Hugh Ald found out about it, he forbade her to teach him anymore, but he had already it already had fostered a love of learning for him, and especially a love of reading. He loved to read, and so he continued to study reading and writing with the other white children on the plantations who were receiving educations from the people that they lived with, mothers or grandmothers or whoever was doing their education at the time. And so he read everything that he could get his hands on. A lot of that was just newspapers. There was at that time that children's books were in short supply, and so the majority of what he was reading were the Bible, and the newspapers that were prominent at the time, and so those he credits I just lost my train of thought. That happens all the time when I'm reading, when I'm talking. The newspaper, what was that called? The Columbian Orator. So the Columbian Orator, and he credits that much later in his autobiographies as kind of like defining his views on human rights and kind of establishing his views, and then also help building his opposition to slavery, which he would carry with him for the rest of his life, and to kind of do that at a young age was kind of impressive. So here he is. He knows how to read and write. And he's passionate about slavery, and about human rights. And so he begins kind of sharing his knowledge, and he's very young now. We're still talking like early teens, sharing his knowledge with other enslaved people. And so once he was hired out to a plantation owner named William Freeland, and on William's plantation, on Mr. Freeland's plantation, he began holding a weekly church service where he taught slaves to read and write. And popularity by reading the New Testament, and popularity grew. And at one point in time, at its peak, there were over 40 slaves attending these weekly lessons, these weekly services, what they kind of touted it as a church service, so that the people around them would not kind of catch on to the fact that he was teaching people to read and write. And so William Freeland, he found out about it, and he didn't much interfere with these lessons. But once the public found out, the mass public, other local slave owners broke up their meeting with clubs and stones, and they never met again together. Definitely did not want him imparting knowledge on the masses. So at age 16, because he had been considered, I guess, a troublemaker, his role in these weekly lessons and whatnot, he was sent to work for a man named Edward Covey, who had a reputation at the time of being a slave breaker. And so that's someone who literally demoralizes, abuses, breaks them down to the point of submission, and very physical abuse, like constant beatings. So Covey's abuse nearly broke Douglass psychologically. Like, it literally shattered him, psychologically. But eventually he fought back, which he details that incident in his autobiography, in a physical confrontation with Covey, and he beat him. And so after that, Covey never put a hand on him again. So in 1838, 1837 to 1838, he attempted to escape from slavery twice. And he had fallen in love with this woman. Her name was Anna Murray, and he, with her help, she procured for him a sailor's uniform, a freed black sailor's free papers, and her life savings. She helped him to escape successfully, and he did that on September the 3rd in 1838. He boarded a train, dressed as a sailor, carrying those free seaman's papers, and he made his way across from Baltimore to New York within 24 hours to the safe house of an abolitionist named David Ruggles. And so once he was there, he sent for Anna, and they adopted a name of Johnson because, he left slavery illegally. And at the time, you had the Fugitive Slave Act, which was very much in force, that slaves that had run away could be chased down, hunted down, and brought back to live with their masters. It was a law, a fugitive slave bill, I guess I should say. Law is kind of a construct. But so he changed his name to Johnson to kind of avoid recognition, and they got married. And he settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which had a huge free black community, and he really thrived there in that community. And once they were there, they changed his name back to Douglass because he wanted to embrace who he was and his identity. They had 5 children together. During that time, he established the North Star, which was an abolitionist-run newspaper. The motto, I found this really interesting. The motto for the newspaper was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the father of us all, and we are all brethren, was kind of the motto of this newspaper. So, I mean, men, women, color, no matter, we're all brother and sister, and God is our father. And I think that kind of speaks to what that paper was trying to promote. So he was a little bit unfaithful multiple times throughout his marriage, and they had he and Anna had a rocky marriage. She died, and in within a year, really, after her death, he married Helen Pitts. So Pitts was from Hanoi, New York. She was the daughter of Gideon Pitts Jr., who was one of Douglass's abolitionist colleagues. And and she was a feminist. She wrote for a radical feminist publication. And so they had a lot of things in common. They shared a lot of the same moral principles. But their marriage was like really controversial because, for one, she was white. Two, she was 20 years younger than he was, and kind of like in the mindset of others, especially his children, what was he doing with a white woman, after everything that kind of he had been through. And so it was a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of controversy that surrounded that. But they married, they moved to New Haven, Massachusetts. Is that the right place? I just want to make sure that I New Haven, something like that, something along those lines. New Bedford. I don't know why I said New Bedford, Massachusetts. So they settled in New Bedford, and so he starts traveling about about Massachusetts at first, and then later, like going further. So he began traveling about, telling his story at abolitionist rallies. And he became like a regular anti-slavery lecturer, but crowds weren't always hospitable to him. Actually, he got ran out in the Midwest when he was on a tour in 1843. He was chased and beaten by an angry mob and was rescued by a Quaker family that came to his aid. He wrote and published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. The book was an immediate bestseller and was translated into several European languages. The problem is that Frederick Douglass wasn't legally free, and so because he had published under his name, he actually left the country for 2 years to escape, to evade being captured and brought back into slavery. And so he lived for a while in England and Britain, actually, and then in Ireland as well, where he was very popular for his the evils of his lectures on the evils of slavery. And he had a lot of British supporters, and it was them who gathered together the funds to purchase his legal freedom. And in 1847, he returned back to the United States as a free man. He continued to write, speak, and fight injustices against African Americans and women. At the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, it was a convention on women's rights. He was asked by Elizabeth Cady Stanton to speak, and so he stood up and said that he could not accept the right to vote as a black man if women could not also claim that right. By the time of the Civil War, he was one of the most famous black men in the country, and he used that status to help influence the treatment of African Americans and their role in the country. In 1863, he met with President Abraham Lincoln regarding the treatment of black soldiers, and later he met with President Andrew Johnson on the subject of the right for black people to vote, black suffrage. After the war, he held several political offices. He served as a president of a bank, the Freedmen's Bank. He served as ambassador to the Dominican Republic, the minister resident, or kind of like the ambassador to Haiti. He became the first African American nominated without his consent for VP of the United States, but he never campaigned because it wasn't with his knowledge or with his consent. But he was the first African American to ever appear on a presidential ballot. In February 20th, 1895, he was returning home from a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He had a massive stroke, heart attack. They're not really sure which one it was, but he passed away as a result. And so Douglass is known for being one of the most famous intellectuals of his time, which is crazy despite he didn't receive a formal education. So anyway, that's very interesting.